Up, down.
Okay, let me get the slides up for you.
Okay.
Okay, so can everybody see PowerPoint? Can you see them, Gary?
There we go. Yeah.
Yep. Good.
Okay.
So I'm going to full screen it and pass the mic over to you.
All right. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay. Ready to go? Okay. Well, I guess I'll get started.
Yes.
Welcome to the second of our three Saturday. Well, it's late afternoon for me. It's morning and very early morning for some of you. And again, I do appreciate the people that are getting up very early on a Saturday for this. You must be either very bored or very, very interested in this. And I hope it's the second. It's the latter of the two. What I'm going to talk about today is you can see about the heading here is the title is Look Inside the World. That's so the title of the second chapter of the book. But I'm kind of collapsing material from that chapter and the chapter that follows, which is about Goethe. The first chapter is about Owen Barfield, his work, and the chapter in the book that followed, I think it's called The Knower and the Known. That is about Goethe. And they're an interesting pairing because in a way, they're at either end of Rudolf Steiner, if not to put it in quite so visual a way, in the sense that Goethe was sort of the central inspiration for Rudolf Steiner's work. And Owen Barfield came to Steiner early in his career and late in Steiner's. He met him just at, I think, the year before Steiner died, very, very, very briefly, when Steiner was in London for a lecture. But he came to Steiner after developing ideas on his own that he discovered very much along the same lines of Steiner's own work. And he was a very humble, modest character. And he said that, the sort of thing I was doing was just sort of a very small kind of patch on this huge edifice of the work that Steiner was doing. But in many ways, both of them are based on or grow out of a kind of tradition that we can see Goethe as not necessarily starting, but putting together in what we can see kind of the modern European way of looking at it. So we have Owen Barfield, who is he? And I apologize for this rather kind of fuzzy nature shot here, but in a way it's kind of appropriate because it's all about being able to sort of have a participatory experience with the world, the natural world, and in that way it's not going to be quite as in focus as it is most of the time. So we go to the next slide. Okay, here, so we have Owen Barfield, Inkling, and Anthroposophist. The Inklings, as you may know, were a group of writers, poets, and novelists who met at a pub in Oxford called the Babe and Bird, I believe. Eagle and Child, I think they called it the Babe and Bird, or Bird and Babe, casually. And among them were people like C.S. Lewis, who's on the beginning over here on the left side, and Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. And at the very end, the glasses of a fellow named Charles Williams, who's not as well known, but he was part of this group. And in the 1930s and 40s, he wrote a series of sort of occult or esoteric kind of thrillers that they're very much of their time. They're very English, it's kind of like drawing room esoteric sort of thrillers, but they still kind of are very readable and have some insights into sort of esoteric teaching. Williams was a member of the Golden Dawn for a while, and he was also a Dante scholar. But the fellow next to him, in between he and Tolkien, is Owen Barfield. And Barfield, in a way, predates both Lewis and Tolkien's sort of the work that they're most well known for, their fantasy writing, in the sense that he wrote a kind of adult fantasy novel, not in the sense that you might think that term would mean, but in the sense in the tradition of people like William Morris or E.R. Edison and George MacDonald, a kind of fable, a kind of fairy tale, but in a sort of adult kind of literature setting. And it's something called The Silver Trumpet, and that was in the 20s, and it wasn't as well known. But in the circle, his ideas were informing people like Tolkien and Lewis, and he was great friends with Lewis. They had something they called the Great War that went on for a long time. It was this debate between the two of them, and the debate was in many ways over Barfield's interest in Rudolf Steiner's work, who I'm over here. And as I said, Barfield came across Steiner in sort of about 1924. I think Steiner died in 25. And he had already started this work that we're going to get onto in a moment. But when he came across Steiner's whole kind of system, anthroposophy, he felt that Steiner had sort of created a whole kind of system of knowledge and way of living that he had only kind of touched on in a small way, which I think is a bit modest. He didn't create a system in the way that Steiner did, but he had insights into the sorts of things that Steiner was talking about. And I think in many ways, if you want to get into Steiner and you don't want to start with Steiner himself, Barfield is a good person to start with because he's very readable. He writes very well. He has an elegant style. But the next slide then. Two early books of his set him going on what he would work on for the rest of his life. And he's someone that, there's a famous essay by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And it's about two different types of characters of personality, where the hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows lots of little things. And Barfield said that he was very much a hedgehog. There was one big thing that he knew, there was one big idea that he had, and that pretty much everything he wrote for the rest of his life was based on this idea. And that one big thing was this notion of the evolution of consciousness. And he came to this through a study of language. And in these two books, the two early books of his, one is called The History in English Words. It's not a history of English words, but it's a way, he says, to be able to understand history through the English language, through looking at language. And he would say you could do this with other languages as well. English is the one that he knew and he felt that he could write about. Clearly. The other book that was written around the same time is called Poetic Diction, and it's a study of meaning. And it's fundamentally about a look at how poetry has the effect that it has. How does poetry have, why is poetry poetic? Why does a line of poetry, very good, when it's good poetry, have this kind of effect on us? An aesthetic effect, Barfield will say ultimately that it has an effect on consciousness, and we'll get onto it. Or the aesthetic effect that we feel is in fact a kind of alteration in our consciousness. And he's trying to understand how language manages to do that. And as you see at the bottom down there, the seminal text that inspired Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, this was something that they were all talking about in this pub in Oxford in the 20s. And then they subsequently went on and do their work. What happened with Barfield is that even though he wrote these books and he wrote for several journals and he was in touch with people like T.S. Eliot and others in the literary world in London at that time, he wasn't able to make a living at doing it. And then rather than go on to an academic life as Lewis and Tolkien did, Williams worked in the city, I believe, if I'm not. He wrote his novels on the side. Barfield had to do the same thing, but he wasn't writing novels. He was writing these sort of literary and philosophical texts about language. And he had to go into his family's law firm. They were solicitors in London. And so from about, I'd say, the end of the 20s, the 30s, he had pulled back from trying to make a living as a writer. And for the next 20, 30 years or so, I think probably 30 years, that's what he did. And during that time, he wrote essays. A lot of them were published in a magazine called The Golden Blade. That was a kind of in-house magazine for the Anthroposophical Society in England, in London, and that's the system that Steiner developed. And here and there, a few bits of journalism. But it really wasn't until sort of the 60s that his work was kind of rediscovered, and when he retired from working as a solicitor, and then he started to write again. And he was kind of picked up by the academic world in the States. This was sort of the time of kind of this sort of new religion kind of movement. People like Paul Tillich and some others at the time who were trying to understand religion in a new kind of modern way. And one book in particular that we'll touch on later on, called Saving the Appearances, that Barfield wrote later in life, was something that was important to them. But next slide, if we can go on to that. He was a brilliant thinker in his own right, even though, as I say, he's most known as being a friend of Lewis and for being a kind of eloquent expositor of Steiner's work. But he was a brilliant thinker and writer in his own right about, as I said, the evolution of consciousness through language. And he came to this lifelong study basically through the experience of metaphor. Grasping for the first time what a metaphor is and how it does what it does. And there's a picture here of the Roman statesman Cato, excuse me, I'm not a Latinist, so I don't quite know if my pronunciation will be correct. But Barfield tells a story in a lecture he gave about how, when he was in school and he was in the Latin class and he was given a sort of sentence to translate. And the sentence, I'm going to try to read it, is Cato octoginta annos natus excessit ad vita, which in a sort of standard English translation would read basically, Cato, 80 years of age, departed this life. And it basically means he died. And what Barfield said was that, yes, just saying, oh, he departed life is you know, it works. It's an accurate translation. It gives you the information. But one of his fellow students said, well, you know, we could say Cato at the age of 80 walked out of life. And somehow that the image of him actually walking, I mean, even saying departed instead of dying is metaphoric, you know, depart, you know, he went to the departure lounge, basically. You know, we all have kind of euphemistic ways to talk about dying in that kind of way. But, you know, it's a metaphor. It implies a kind of journey you're taking on, which, you know, strict scientific truth is saying, well, that's just kind of fantasy. You die. So Cato died when he was 80 years old. But this whole image of him walking out of life, it struck Barfield, and it made it living. It gave the language its vital character. It was figurative, you know, what we call figurative language, an imaginative use of the language. As you say, a dry translation would just say, well, Cato died when he was 80. But this whole image of the grand, you know, orator, you know, walking out of life is something that's more poetic, imaginative, it's more alive, it has movement and color. And this struck Barfield. And he wanted to understand, like, what was this all about? You know, how did this happen? And as he started to look at metaphor, he came upon a discovery that most people who start to look at this thing discover as well, is that we use metaphors all the time, and we don't, you know, recognize that that's what we're doing. They start out originally as a kind of vivid image to convey an idea, as, you know, the vivid image of Cato walking out of life. But over time, over use, they become flattened out, and they no longer have the kind of imaginative charge that they once have. So I have an image here of water under a bridge, and say in the book, if you know, there's, I mean, I don't know, there was an old, you know, cartoon, comic routine when I was a kid with two comics, where the one comic would use a metaphor and the other one would just be absolutely literal and serious, and he would say, what do you mean water under a bridge? What bridge? You know, what water? And that kind of thing. And he wasn't able to communicate anything, because anytime he would say something in a metaphor, the other person would be literal about it. And it's a way of understanding that all the time we do use this kind of metaphorical language, but we don't recognize that it is that. And one of the effects of poetry, one of the effects of something like philosophy, is where you have a sudden kind of recognition that, oh yes, what you're saying and you take for granted as just a way of communicating something actually has this kind of poetic character to it, and that's the metaphor. And this was something that Barfield started to understand. He started to enjoy language for its own sake, not as just something to communicate something. And he started to understand this kind of freshness about the language, a kind of vitality. And he wanted to understand, how did that happen? So if we can go on to the next slide. And what he discovered is that poetry has this effect. He talks about the metaphors that Shelley uses. Shelley talks about how Percy Bysshe Shelley here, the great romantic poet, he talks about how the west wind has sort of made him a lyre, the musical instrument. And again, if you were a literalist, you would say, well, that's just a lie. You haven't turned into this musical instrument. But what he means in a metaphorical sense is that somehow the west wind has inspired him to music, to poetry. And even saying inspire is a metaphor, because it's actually a graphic, concrete image of some kind of breath coming into us. We think of it as, this kind of impetus to be creative, to sort of, I'm inspired to write poetry. Well, the original kind of meaning of that, if you think about it, it is something coming into you. And just like the notion of influence, that goes back to the astrological idea that there's some kind of fluid coming from the stars and flowing from the stars that actually influences us. It affects us in some way. We just say influence and we think of some vague notion of an effect, but it actually has a very concrete, visceral kind of meaning. And what Barfield saw was what the effect of poetry, what he was getting from poetry, the effect that language was having on him when he was coming on it in poetry. The same sort of thing was being produced when he was looking at ancient languages. And he discovered that the further he looked back into time, into the history of language, the more figurative the language becomes. Our language, I'll get onto in a bit, is much more abstract. As I just said, we use the word influence and we just have a vague general idea of something having an effect on us, where it started out as something much more vivid and concrete, figurative. And what Barfield saw as the same thing that poets were trying to do, to use language to have this effect. Ancient languages already had the effect. They were already figurative, just writing about anything. They weren't trying to be figurative as poets do, the good ones, not the ones who just sort of take a sentence and break it in half. But the ancient languages, they were doing the exact same thing, just in communicating whatever they were saying that the poets were doing. And this led him to try and understand, well, why is that the case? Why is it the case that the further we go back into language, the more and more figurative it is, the more imaginative it is. In a way, it's seeing the world as the poets today see the world. So we could go on to the next one. Yeah. So Barfield looked into what sort of were the dominant ideas about the origin of language at the time. And again, this is the 1920s. And most sort of influential theory was the work coming out of work done by Max Muller. And he was a German scholar. He's very famous for a whole series called The Sacred Books of the East. It's some of the earliest translations of a lot of Eastern texts and philosophies and so on. But again, this was at a time when everyone was looking for the origin of everything. There was like the source of the Nile, so the origin of man, and that kind of set the course. That one there, the origin of man, the Darwinian idea of how human beings evolved. And what Barfield saw is that Muller and other sort of linguists at the time, the only way they could look at something like how language started and the origin of language was through this Darwinian kind of spectacle. This was the only way that would, that made any sense. The Darwinian sort of motif had dominated everything. And what did that mean? Well, that meant that originally language must have started out as simple as possible. It must have started out as literal as possible, and kind of in some way from kind of ugs and groans and oogs and things like that, somehow pointing to things. Gradually over time, it became what we know as language. And what Muller had to do is that there's no record of this kind of literal language, this language, this Sprache, that was supposed to be absolutely just as basic literal. And it's what Barfield calls the ug and bow wow kind of school of language origin, in the sense that either human beings tried to mimic natural sounds, or, as they said, they just over time just turned grunts and groans into kind of meaningful things. And if you ever read Wittgenstein sometime, especially his later work, The Philosophical Investigations, you'll see even though it seems absolutely, yes, it must be obvious that you make a noise and you point to something, that people will say that's how, and apparently this is how St. Augustine said he learned, but Wittgenstein said actually you have to have language to begin with to even understand what pointing means. So it's not as easy. So, but Muller is just taking, well, it has to be like that, because how else could it be? Because Darwin's ideas of dominating, and you start with something simple. That's the whole idea about, Darwinian evolution, is you start with something simple, and over time it builds up into something complex. The less creates the more in that sense. And, but as Barfield pointed out, well, there's no record of this kind of simple literal language. The further back you go, it's figurative language. It's metaphorical, poetic language. No matter what you do, you never get to anything that's the way that we talk about literal language now. And so what Muller had to sort of speculate that happened, was that at some point there was a whole sort of generation of these like prehistoric poets. And I have, the beatniks over here to kind of, I don't think they're real beatniks. I think they're kind of more contemporary people that are kind of doing faux beatniks, but they were the closest image I could get. But the whole idea was that at some point, this generation of these prehistoric poets just got a hold of this very literal language, and they turned it into this metaphoric, poetic, figurative, kind of imaginative language. And so the first records that we have of language, it's language that's already been kind of adulterated by these poets. They've come around and they've done all this wonderful stuff with it, made it metaphoric and figurative and all this kind of thing. Why they did it, we don't know. What happened to them afterward, we don't know. But that must be what happened, because there's no other way that we can account for origin of language. Language must have started out being something really simple. And if the only language that we come across from an earlier time is metaphoric, then somebody came around at some point and just started to make it that way. And Barfield said, well, no, what if we say, well, actually, no, it wasn't like that. What if we say the language started out metaphoric to begin with? It wasn't literal and then became metaphoric. It started out metaphoric. It started out figurative. It started out imaginative. It started out that way because that's the way people looked at the world that way. That's how they saw it. And we go on to the next one. And this was a shift, you can say, from poetry to prose. And rather than the literal way of communicating things that we use most of the time now, and that people like Muller believed had to be at the beginning of language, it's actually the result of a historical process. The literalism is something that has grown out of an earlier, more poetic, more metaphoric, more imaginative, more figurative kind of language. And this was something that many other people noticed. It was something that was a very popular idea in the 19th century, in the Romantic period. And different philosophers and poets hypothesized something like this as well. And one of the people that I write about in the book is a 20th century German scholar who writes a lot about 19th century German writing and philosophy, a fellow named Erich Heller. And in the early 80s, he put out a book called In the Age of Prose. And the whole idea is that we started out with this more poetic kind of figurative sort of language. So all the kind of myths, all the sort of accounts of this kind of, the world of gods and goddesses and nature spirits and all this sort of thing, rather than that be something that was just sort of superstition and just bad ideas, or something that some anthropologists say is like was projected into the world, somehow, even Jungians would somehow say that, animism is an effect of, unconscious projection of inner, phenomena out into the world in some way. But they're saying, actually, no, the way people saw the world back then, it was like that in some way. It was much more sort of alive. And what's happened is over time that there's been a change. There's been a change in consciousness. There's been an evolution of consciousness that has gone from a kind of broader, more diffused, participatory consciousness, which is how Barfield talks about it, in the sense that the language of ancient times was figurative because, and it had the same effect on him as poetry, because it had this power to induce a state of participation in him. And participation meant that the kind of strict inner and outer barrier, membrane that we all experience now between our inner world and the outer world is broken down, or, it is dissipated, it's melted temporarily. And there's a sense of a kind of continuum between the outer and the inner, and you are participating in some way. You have an active relationship with it. It's not static. And this was part of the experience that he had from reading the poetry, this kind of sudden flash of a change in consciousness. And if you ever share that kind of experience in reading good poetry, I mean, there's a sense, the shiver down the spine when, it strikes you in this way and it makes you see the world in a different way. This is what he's talking about. And this was something that at an earlier time, he's saying, and Heller and others are saying, that was kind of the way humans were in the world, they experienced the world, but they lacked the kind of self-consciousness that we have. The reason why there was this sort of drawing out of an original kind of, participatory experience of the world was, the result of that drawing out is self-consciousness, or you would not have self-consciousness had that not happened. Or self-consciousness is that, to be able to recognize ourselves as something different from the world, we have to draw ourselves out of it. Now, romantics who pine for the ancient, Edenic time when, we were all at one with the world, they talk about the fall, and they feel that this is a big mistake, and it's understandable. But people like Barfield and Heller and Steiner and others are the ones that I'm talking about in the book and other books of mine. This was a necessary separation in order to develop self-consciousness, in order to develop freedom, in order to develop precisely the kind of thinking that took over in the 16th, in the 17th century, in the 1600s, this kind of, methodical, reductive, industrious, step-by-step, quantitative kind of thinking. Yes, it was a fall. We lost our innocence, but we gained a great deal by doing that. And what Barfield sees is a kind of V movement, a kind of down, or this is something also from Steiner in the sense that there's, in an earlier time, much more participatory. We were, part of the, the great one. We separated. Now we're at a time where we're completely separated. We feel lost in the cosmos. We feel absolutely alienated from this world out there. And the best minds are telling us that it's absolutely meaningless. You have Stephen Hawking telling us this, we don't need God, we don't need this, it just happened. And other people as well. I mentioned Steven Weinberg, in the last class, when, the more we understand the universe, the more pointless it is, and so on and so on. And this is a product of precisely the separation that was necessary in order to develop our freedom. But now we have to sort of move up the other side of the V. And this is moving towards what Barfield calls final participation. There's original participation when we're not aware of it. We don't have self-consciousness. Break away from that, we develop self-consciousness, and then we start to feel lost and alienated because we've broken away. But now the next movement is towards what he calls this final participation, which is something along the lines of the states that he felt from reading poetry, from contemplating the languages, because it's a shift. And I tell you, even if you just try to learn a foreign language, I know when I was first studying German many, many years ago, and I never studied enough to become fluent, but I studied it for a couple of years, and there were times when just being able to grasp how to name something in the other language produced a sense of it being different and produced a different way of seeing things. So it's a kind of different consciousness is sort of housed in the language. And this was something that Barfield felt that, poetry can induce it. It's something that we can move towards in a general way. And this is why he got into studying Steiner's methods and all that, because Steiner talks about something along the same lines. Can we have the next slide? All right, so just to quickly go through this, what Barfield came to understand fundamentally was that language and the world and the I or the self, they all kind of appear at the same time. How Muller and those people looked at it was that there was a world just exactly the same way as we see the world today. So everything was just exactly the way it is now without human beings in it and the effects of human beings. So to go back in time to the ancient times, all you have to do is subtract everything that humans have added to the world, and you go back to its pristine natural state. And it was like that. And then human beings somehow, one ape started to, some reason, we don't know why, became more conscious than the other apes. And then he started to look at things and point to them and go, ugh, ugh, and got that across to the other apes. And as I said, for Barfield, this was absolutely useless as a way of trying to understand language, just because the evidence that language gives us tells us something completely different. And what he's saying is that you can't ask about the origin of language, because language and the world and the self all come together at the same time. And I don't say it in the book, but I do mention this in Secret History of Consciousness. This is one reason why in so many creation myths, it's also a kind of creation of self-consciousness myths. Man and the world come into existence at the same time. You don't have a world until you have some kind of consciousness that can pull itself apart from everything and reflect that there is something other than it. And as far as we know, we're the ones doing that. Of course, there's evidence to suggest that other animals may have something of that. There's something going on, I forget exactly where, about it's in court about whether an elephant could be considered a person or not because of some mistreatment going on. So when I'm pointing out that this is something that happens with humans, I'm not necessarily claiming that it's exclusive to us, but as far as I know, we're the species in which it seems to have happened, obviously without too much doubt. And so you can say that what Barfield's saying is that the world, what we understand is the world other than us, aside from us, that we take for granted, that came into existence when this kind of participatory consciousness started to kind of separate. And what he's saying is that what we used to experience as the inside of the world is now, it's all just inside us. And poetry and language have these strange effects on us because for a flash, we kind of see the inside of the world in the world itself. But now the whole inside of the world is just gone into our individual heads. So we don't think that the world has an inside. We don't think that plants and trees and clouds and stuff like that have an inside. They're just completely outside. The only inside is in here. But before that wasn't the case. That's the case now. And what we're gradually having flashes of, and in different ways, different traditions, learning how to master or some way understand, is to be able to perceive the inside, our own inside, and the inside of the outside. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. We're trying to see the inside of the outside, so if you put it that way. So this is a sort of fundamental idea for Barfield, that all of these things they're all part of the same thing. And this is how he looks at what he calls the evolution of consciousness, because if the world that I see outside is really a product of the separation from an earlier kind of participatory, then it's part of this evolution. It's a development, just like the literalism of our language is the development of language. And Barfield will also say, he talks about the evolution of consciousness takes the idea of the concept of the self as a product of time. It's something that's developed over time. You know, our self-consciousness appeared at a certain time, and it's changed. And if you know people like Jean Gebser and other philosophers as well, even during, you know, ancient time until now, it's changed. Last time I talked about the axial age. So we have this kind of three-way connection among, you know, language. Well, there's the self, the world, and language is the thing that kind of makes that happen, because you need some way to differentiate you from it, and language is the way that started to do it. You know, like, you know, you have to mark something as you, mark something as it, and language was what did it. And the more language developed in that way, the more that split. So initially, you know, it wasn't that wide of a split. You know, we were still participating, and the language reflected that. The language, and what else reflected that? Myths and fairy tales and all these kinds of things about this living kind of world out there. But gradually, you know, the split happened. Okay, so get on to the next one. So I'm just going to get on to Goethe. I just want to leave Barfield for just with two of these kind of conundrums that his very logical mind came up with. And I have here, what did the world look like before there was a human consciousness there to perceive it? And we got a bunch of dinosaurs there and stuff like that. He asked this question because we all know that, at least since the 1920s and the rise of quantum physics, people like Arthur Eddington and others, there's a famous passage in one of Arthur Eddington's books. He says, the table I'm sitting at, you know, it seems solid to me, but in reality it isn't. It's made up of all these subatomic elementary particles. And there's, on their scale, there's vast distances between all of those, equal to, you know, or similar to, analogous to the vast distances between the stars and the galaxies and so on and so on. And so this idea that the real table is just made up of, you know, these particles that are just, you know, in some way it's not solid, and my mind in some way gives it solidity. You know, my mind interprets the world, it interprets these particles in such a way as to make them solid, and, you know, otherwise I wouldn't be able to live in it, and so on and so on. And so the whole idea is that the world we see isn't, it's not really like that. It's not really like anything. It's really like these, you know, weird particles that are just kind of mathematical kind of equations quivering around in space. But it really isn't, you know, the way we see it. Our senses just make it look like that. And so Barfield says, okay, that's fine. But what was the world like before there was human consciousness around to interpret it in that way? And he asked that question because the same scientists that are saying that the world we see today is a product of our consciousness interpreting all the elementary particles, they also talk about what the world was like before humans were around. They talk about it when the dinosaurs, or even before any life was around. You know, whenever, I forget how many billions of years before any sort of life, you know, existed. They talk about whatever, the Earth was like this, it did that, it was this shape, it, you know, whatever, it was melting, whatever the geological record was going on. But Barfield's saying, well, just technically, fellas, you say the kind of world that we see depends on our mind interpreting it, but if there's no mind back there interpreting it, then we can't with all confidence say it was just like it is now. It could very well have been very different. And that sets him up to be able to say, well, indeed, there are some philosophers who do say it was very different. And hence we go back to what he was saying before. It wasn't the solid kind of, you know, absolutely other world that we experience. It was something perhaps that was much more like the way myths talk about, like the way Steiner talks about. Steiner talks about this kind of picture world that was much more like dream states, and everything was much more fluid and changeable, and so on and so on. And so again, he just raises, you know, that kind of question. And the next one, we'll get to the next one too. Another one he points out, and this is in the book Saving the Appearances, and I talk about this in Secret History of Consciousness, is the whole idea of how real a rainbow is. And, you know, there's three things you need to have a rainbow. You have to have rain, you have to have sunlight, and you have to have somebody there to see it. because the rainbows produce for us through our eyes interpreting the refraction of the light coming through the raindrops, and it creates the raindrops. So he asked the question, well, how real is a rainbow? I mean, we all accept that it's real, or it's real in a kind of, real in quotation marks, because you could say it's a hallucination that we all agree to accept as real. But we don't really think of it that way. When I say there's a rainbow, I don't say, oh, look at that hallucination. It's not really over there. And of course, we know if we run to it, we're not gonna get to it. And even that raises a whole other kind of series of questions. So, but the reason he brings this up and brings up the other thing about, what was the world like before human consciousness was around to interpret it, is that he's showing how human consciousness is in an intimate relationship with the world that we perceive. And when we're in this kind of naive state, we usually are in, when we don't recognize that, we just take it for granted that there's a world outside there that is the way it is, and it always has been like that, and it will be like that whether I'm around or not. This is the kind of naive state that I'll get onto him in a little bit more. The philosopher Edmund Husserl calls the natural standpoint, which is just this kind of unquestioned acceptance of this whole idea of that the world is the way it is and has always been like that. Okay, so that's Barfield. Now let's get on to Goethe. Okay, so Goethe, we kind of know him. He's one of the big names like Shakespeare and Dante and Homer. He's never really translated that well into English. I mean, in the sense that people know the name, but they don't necessarily know why he should be that famous. That translation there of the Faust by Walter Kaufmann is one of the better ones. But he sort of came to fame first by writing this romantic short novel called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And Goethe more or less invented Romanticism, German Romanticism. And it's about unrequited love, and the hero at the end blows his brains out. And in fact, the novel sort of triggered a whole series of copycat suicides in Europe. It was so powerful, it had such an effect. But one of the things that made it so powerful is that Goethe is writing about this kind of, his character in the Werther he's thrown into ecstasy by nature. And this is something that really wasn't happening before then. Obviously people knew nature, they wrote about nature, but the wilderness, the wild, the uncivilized wasn't something that was considered, someplace to go to. It was something to stay away from. In the previous, certainly in the early 18th century, the 17th century, it was something, to avoid and to sort of conquer. But Werther is thrown into these ecstasies by nature, by natural phenomena, by clouds and rivers and things of that sort. And this sort of unfits him completely for everyday life. He can't find any place in the world. He's so different from other people around him. And this is kind of the beginning of the romantic kind of consciousness, which starts to see this fantastic beauty in nature and yearns for this kind of freedom and wants to kind of throw off the sort of constraints of civilization. And Goethe did that, but then he kind of outgrew that. He sort of wrote himself out of that kind of state, even though he gave birth to a whole generation of Goethean kind of characters. And the Faust, as I mentioned already, that's sort of the work he worked on for most of his life. He wrote the first part early on, and then late in life he finished it. But it's fundamentally a work about what is worth knowing. It's fundamentally about, is knowledge good in itself? This is sort of the Faustian kind of dilemma. Faust is, he wants knowledge, he wants it. It doesn't matter what it is, he just wants it. He has this kind of hunger for knowledge. And this was sort of what was happening at the time. And this is why Goethe, will get onto it, because he wanted knowledge as well, but he also understood there was some knowledge that wasn't worth knowing, and there was other knowledge that was absolutely necessary to know, and all that. So, but we know him as a poet, but we don't know him as much as a scientist. And if we can get on to the next slide. Yes, he was also a scientist. He did a lot of work in evolution. This is drawings of it's in there somewhere. Don't ask me where exactly, but there's something called the intermaxillary bone, which Goethe used to show that man was part of nature because other animals had it. He believed in an evolution, but not a Darwinian one. He believed in nature for him was this kind of mystical kind of living consciousness at work in the world and experimenting and transforming and, and so on and so on. And so he believed in evolution in the sense that, there was change and transformation. This was something that obsessed him throughout his whole life, but it wasn't driven by, arbitrary just survival of the fittest and mindless kind of necessity. It was driven by an inner urge to grow. And as we'll see, he also did work on optics and many other things. But what he was most known for, at least in this context we're talking about, was work he did on plant morphology. So if we can get to the next slide, yes. And this is something that you can find out about in a wonderful book of his called The Italian Journey. And I have up here, it's In Search of the Urpflanze. And the Italian journey was an account of precisely that. As all good Germans did, he went down to the land of the citrons, down to the south. All the good Germans want to go down south. And Nietzsche went down there, and Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann and all that. It's the Teutonic ones that want to stay up in the dark forests and all that kind of thing. But it's a remarkable book because it's Goethe the poet, but he's writing about nature, but it's no longer in this ecstatic gushing about, wonderful, beautiful nature and all that kind of thing. Not that he's against that, but he's trying to understand it now scientifically. He's another one of these characters who's trying to bring the two different ways of knowing together. And if you ever read it, he's writing about the geology and the geography and the mineralogy of the place and the lay of the land and all this kind of thing. And he actually insulted quite a few of his Italian friends because when he was in Rome and other places, he didn't go to all the must-see sites. You have to go see this, you have to go see that. He didn't go there. He was more interested in seeing sort of scientific kinds of things. And he writes about that in the Italian journey. But one of the things he writes about in it is when he was in the botanical gardens in Palermo. And it was there that he said he discovered the Urpflanze. And what is the Urpflanze? It's a German word that means the primal plant, the original plant, the archetypal plant. It's sort of the plant from which all of the plants have grown. And he doesn't mean some actual plant that grew in some place at some time in that way. For him, it's a kind of, what do you want to say? It's a kind of blueprint. As I say, archetype, but I don't want to get, it's not like a Jungian archetype. It's a form. It's a kind of form that is, Goethe said he could see it by patient observation of plants. And why it could suddenly see it vividly in Palermo was that his observations had hitherto been at home in places like Frankfurt and Weimar and all that. And he was just, studying plants in a unnatural conditions in the hothouse. And here in Palermo, out in the hot sun, he could see them in their natural setting. And he suddenly had the vision of the Urpflanze, and it was there. And it was something that he saw. It's not physical, and it's not an idea. It's somewhere in between. It inhabits, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it inhabits what Henri Corbin calls the imaginal realm, which is this kind of in-between sphere of existence that it's not an abstract idea, and it's not a physical thing. And it's an imaginal sort of thing. It occupies this realm that we can see and grasp through our imagination. And come to the next slide. Goethe got to this search for the Urpflanze through earlier being a student of alchemy. He actually practiced alchemy at home. He had sort of a alchemical laboratory going like upstairs in the attic when he was a young man. And he performed several different things, and he wasn't that successful in any kinds of the actual chemical transformations, but the whole philosophy of alchemy and the ideas behind it. And as I said, this whole notion of transformation, this was something that was essential theme for Goethe. And, but he was involved with a group of pietists, and this was a sort of religious movement that was very popular in that part of Germany, that he was in Frankfurt. And they were readers of people like Jakob Böhme. He was the Bohemian cobbler turned mystic who had a sudden vision of what he called the signature of things, when a glint of sunlight off a pewter dish sent him into this kind of mystical state. And also they read Paracelsus, and he was the Swiss alchemist. And Paracelsus too, he talked about how you could look into nature in the same way as you could look into a glass. There was a way to look into things and to see the inside of them, and to see, you know, I said, their heart, you know, what was the life inside them. And this was something that Goethe took from his alchemical interests. And he tells a story of how when he was in Strasbourg, once, and Strasbourg is a city that is on the German-French border. It's been part of Germany and part of France different times over the years. He went to see the cathedral, which at one time was the tallest building in Europe. And he studied it from all different angles, inside and out, and trying to, you know, catch it in different sort of shadows and different refractions of light. But what he felt was that at some point along the line, the original plan had been changed. And he said at some point, it went off from what the original idea was. And he drew what for him would have been how it looked had it stuck to the original plan. And just before he left, he was at a cafe, you know, whatever, with friends, and he talked about this, and he showed them the picture. And someone there knew the architect, and he said, yes, you're right. You know, there was an original idea to do something different, but it came up against some complications, and, you know, it had to change. And the friend said, well, how did you know? And Goethe said, well, the cathedral itself told me. I spent a great deal of time looking at it and being with it, and, you know, having kind of an intimate relationship with it. And I looked at it from all different angles, and I developed a kind of inner warmth. And this is this notion of active seeing. This is a way in which, you know, we can bring a kind of living warmth to how we're perceiving things. I mean, the way to observe things that had been becoming more and more popular in Goethe's time was this, what we were talking about earlier, this kind of new way of knowing, which is, you know, you're distant, you're objective, you're cold. You don't have to be cold, but you're supposed to keep you out of what you're observing, because you will disturb it. And Goethe, very early on, much earlier than Werner Heisenberg, recognized that that's just a fantasy. You know, the observer and the observer are intimately connected. And the thing was to get into a rapport with what you're observing, and that it will tell you, it will talk to you. And this is how he learned that the cathedral had, you know, the plans had changed. And it's the same way how he learned to see the Earthpflanze. Can we get on to the next one? There's a famous story when Goethe went to a scientific conference in Jena, in Germany, and he met Friedrich Schiller there. And Friedrich Schiller was the other great poet of the age. And Schiller too was interested in science. And I don't know if I mentioned it in the last one, but, you know, one of the best books to read about all this kind of stuff, and I didn't have a chance to talk about it in the book, is Schiller wrote what's known as his Letters of Aesthetic Education. It comes out of different translations, but it's like that. Schiller's Letters on Aesthetic Education. There's a series of letters that he wrote to someone just precisely about being able to bring the two different sides together, to sort of the intellect and the intuition and all that. So he was interested in this kind of thing. And they were at this scientific conference, and they both kind of commiserated on the way science was being practiced, this, you know, this new quantitative, reductive, you know, cutting everything down into bits and pieces and that kind of thing. And they both said, no, we should be able to understand nature as a whole. As I said before, it's not this passive stuff that outside stimuli work on and then, you know, move around, and we can chart that. It has an inner urge. It's an inner living thing that's moving out into the world. And, you know, it was through that kind of motion that Goethe wanted to be able to, you know, study it. And they talked about this, and they both sort of shook their head. And then Goethe basically said, well, you know, I actually have developed a way to do this. And he talked about, you know, the Earthpflanze and this active seeing and this kind of warmth, you know, this kind of way in which you perceive something, in which you develop a relationship with it. You're not cold and distant. And again, it isn't being subjective. It isn't this gushing kind of emotional relationship with nature as Goethe had earlier and the Romantic poets were still having. The intensity, the direction, the intention is there, but you're not projecting anything into it except your attention, and it will respond to that attention. And what Goethe was talking, I mean, Schiller basically said, well, that's a nice idea, but that's all it is. It's an idea. You know, the Irrflans, it sounds wonderful, but you know, it's not something I can see. And Goethe, he was actually, you know, he was the sort of exemplar of tact. He said, well, in that case, I must be able to see ideas. I am able to see ideas, because he said, this is something I saw. And I studied the plant, I watched the plant, I look at the plant through all of its development, you know, from the seed, the sapling, he goes through every step, and he would observe the plant over time, and then he would sort of recreate it in his imagination, that process, and make drawings over time. It was through that he was able to actually perceive this, what he called the Irrflans in there. And what I say in the book, this is very much along the lines of what Husserl had mentioned earlier, talks about in what he called phenomenology. And again, basic step in this is what he calls stepping out of the natural standpoint. And again, it's stepping out of that, what we take for granted to be consciousness as it is, this kind of passive reflection of things, a mirror, where it isn't that. We're unaware of our active participation. I mean, there's a negative side of that, because we project things into the world that objectively aren't there. You know, if you're in a bad mood, everybody around you is horrible. You know, that person in front of you at the supermarket, you know, is absolutely a murderous character that, you know, should be, you know, exterminated. But if you're in a good mood, everyone's wonderful. And you see all these lovely kind of things that you never noticed before. So, you know, we're already doing this kind of thing, but we don't know we're doing it. One of the first steps in any kind of spiritual, or, you know, I would say good psychological practice, is to be able to start to understand that. And this is what, in a more philosophical way, Husserl's talking about when he's saying you step out of the natural standpoint. You basically don't take for granted what you do take for granted in that way. But and then through that practice, you begin to understand that the way we perceive the world is in itself a creative act. It's just the sheer fact of perceiving the world. It isn't passive reflection. It's a creative grabbing. Husserl talks about intention. And in the book, I have a quotation from philosopher Paul Ricoeur. And again, this isn't, you know, Husserl's not a mystic, although he talks about wanting to get to the keepers of the key of being. And, you know, he, like many, he was deeply influenced by Goethe and all that. But they're very, you know, rigorous, you know, German philosophers. And Paul Ricoeur is a French philosopher. So this is a very rigorous philosophical tradition. But he talks about how if you understand what Husserl's talking about, you'll see that the very act of perceiving is a creative act. So when we're just looking at the world and we take it for granted that we're just passively reflecting it, we already are in some way creating reality. And again, we don't mean creating reality in some prosperity gospel kind of way. What we're trying to understand is the relationship between our mind and the reality where we perceive. Because for Goethe, truth is in that in-between place. So let's get on to the next one so we have enough time for some questions. Okay, I was just going to say that Goethe, okay, I'm up to an hour already, but let me just go quickly on to a couple more things, and so we leave time for some questions. I mean, this was another area where Goethe took on, you know, standard science with Newton, and what he based his argument was Newton is that Newton tortured light in order to get his results. He treated it in this unnatural way. And what Goethe was interested in is how do we experience color? How do we experience it? Not what is it made of, which is what Newton was doing. He wants to know how we experience it. And that way, again, it's a kind of phenomenology. And he's trying to understand what our experience of these things are, rather than, you know, what are they made of, or what can we reduce them to? So that's a different kind of approach. And again, this is part of the kind of Goethean science, and it doesn't necessarily go to the kind of results that the other kind of science does, but it enriches our understanding of reality. And in many ways, that's as important. So we can get to the next. Yeah, okay, here's the thing. Where is truth? And again, that's even a different way of positing, because we usually say, what is truth? But where is truth? Okay, so the X-Files and lots of the scientists say the truth is out there, meaning and the X-Files say it's really out there. But, you know, the truth is out there. It's out in the world somewhere. You can go out and find it. It's, you know, or the other way, the idealist kind of way, the subjective way, everything is inside your head. You know, it's a dark kind of vision here I found, but, you know, in a way, that kind of thinking does lead to that. You know, everything is just inside your head, and eventually that'll lead to kind of solipsism. So one way leaves out the inner and the other way leaves out the outer, and somehow they can't be right. So is truth perhaps in this in-between place? That's the next slide. I said before, like in the last talk, this Goldilocks kind of situation where it's just right. So Goethe believed that truth was in this area where the inner and the outer meet. And he talks about a secret harmony, because there's a hidden law in the outer world and a hidden law in the inner world. And when those two come together, this is when truth happens. So there's a kind of functional, pragmatic, effective truth that the quantitative way of knowing can arrive at. And that's very good for practical kinds of things. But Goethe is talking about truth in this other kind of way, which is not, it's not that kind of truth. It's a kind of truth that we need to know. It's a truth about our being. It's a truth about our existence. It's a truth about our relationship to the world, which, if we did know it, in many ways would help us curb the excesses of the other kind of thinking. So Goethe is one of these people who brings the two kinds of things together. He brings the two sides. He's a scientist, he's a poet. He's bringing the two together to try and understand a deeper level of knowledge. And maybe we can get on to just one more. Now, this is just quickly, just to say who was influenced by this besides Steiner. Two people that talk about in a bit of the book, where one was the German philosopher Friedrich Schelling, who's probably the most important person involved with what was called Naturphilosophie in the 19th century in Germany. And this was a kind of philosophy and science that was trying to see the world in many ways in terms of the way Goethe was seeing it. And Schelling had an enormous influence in Russia, strangely enough. I'm working on a book on Russia now. And he was like the first German. Usually we think of Germans influencing Russia as like Marx, but there was Hegel, and then actually before Hegel was Schelling. And it was the whole idea for him that somehow mind and nature were polarities. They were involved in a kind of polar relationship. So it wasn't all in the mind, and it wasn't mind was just something that was in, happened arbitrarily in nature. They were in a polar relationship. And some of his arguments may strike us now as not particularly scientific in the usual sense, but they have a kind of poetic power of analogy. And Schelling's ideas were very, very important in development of philosophy of art and criticism and the whole romantic way of viewing the world. And the other one is Coleridge, who I do talk about in the book. And he developed a whole system of metaphysics. He's actually an English metaphysic. We know him as a poet. He wrote, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan and so on and so on. But he actually wrote reams and reams of a kind of metaphysics based on Schelling's ideas and the sorts of ideas we're talking about. But he too developed a whole system around polarity, this whole notion that there's a tension. Reality is a kind of tension between these opposites. And this is something you can trace back to people like Boehme. Jakob Boehme talks about that in his books in this kind of dense alchemical kind of language. But this is a kind of fundamental activity that's going on. And people like Blake, without contraries, there's no progress, and opposition is true friendship and all that. Okay, so last before one slide. This brings us around in the end to Barfield. Barfield wrote a very interesting book about Coleridge and developing the idea of polarity. This is a still from a short documentary about Barfield called Man and Meaning, which you can get on YouTube. I think it was made probably about 95. I actually spent hours transcribing the dialogue, the script. At the end of it, I have a tiny little credit if you watch it. But this is before I met Barfield. I actually met Barfield in 1997. I think a year before he died. He died at the age of 99. And I conducted the last interview with him. And he was very, very, very alert, very sharp, intellectually alive character at the time. And yeah, so that's Barfield and Goethe. And next week is the next slide. Yeah. Ooh. Responsible imagination. That's a phrase that comes from Barfield. He talked about the need for a responsibility of the imagination. That if our mind, basically is involved with the world out there, the world we see, And if consciousness evolves, it's continuing to evolve, that what we are imagining now, may very well affect what is reality, down the line at some point. And this is an idea that comes up a lot of places today. I talk about it I talk about it at the end of Lost Knowledge, and it comes up in another book, Dark Star, which is about Trump and postmodern occult politics and all this kind of thing. But it was also, the new interest in new thought and mental science and all. Again, it's a whole you create your own reality meme. So this is something that all of these thinkers I'm talking about, yes, they think this is true. It is true. What happens in the mind does have an effect out in the outer world, and it's our first job is to understand what that process is, and then to understand that there's a responsibility for it. Okay, so thank you very much for that, and I guess I can take some of your questions now.
All right, thank you, Gary. That was excellent. As always, I have taken a lot of notes. And for those who are curious for the chapter, I was looking at chapter 3 as you were speaking as well in Lost Knowledge. That's where the content on Goethe is, if you're just curious to get some more terminology and notes for your notes. But okay, so we do have some questions. Let's see where we can start. We have a short comment from Mike just saying All Hallows Eve by Charles Williams is a very creepy story and is recommended.
Absolutely.
I haven't read Charles Williams, so thank you for that. I didn't realize he was writing.
Yeah, it's worth reading.
It does, yeah. So here's a question from Chris, and Chris is asking, could you describe how Barfield used the letter U to illustrate the path from passive participation to scientific materialism to active participation?
Well, he sort of gets it. It's kind of from Steiner as well, where it's sort of, and again, it's in a way it's very similar to a motif in the Hermetic and Gnostic tradition, where with them it's like down and up, the same thing. You go down from the one down the planets down to here, and the Kabbalah as well, and then you work your way back up through the planets or the Sephiroth. But with Steiner and Barfield, and Steiner himself uses all the language of the planets too. He talks about old Sun and old Saturn and all that kind of thing, his previous forms of consciousness. But the idea is that in the earliest times that they're talking about, consciousness was inside the world, whatever you want to say. There wasn't any difference between us and the world, and put it that way. It was one. It was this kind of great surround. And if you want to think of it that way, say that was up there at that point, and then gradually it starts to separate. And you could see this, okay, if if Gebser is kind of a guideline, you can say, okay, you start with the archaic. It's not a you, but again, it's the same kind of process as the archaic, which is complete identity. There's no difference between, there is no you. There's no you, there's not even an us, there's just whatever. And then gradually, something separates, it's a little less embedded. So likewise with this kind of descent. So you gradually descend from these more states in which you are at one with the spirit world, the higher kind of world, and there's a gradual descent. And as it descends, there's a separation, and there's a sense of, contraction. And one of the interesting things that came to me as I was sort of going over the notes is that when Barfield talks about how original participation, the shift from original participation to, where we are now, where we don't feel participation at all, was a contraction. It was something that was vague and diffuse, that permeated the whole kind of global area, which is the kind of way the right brain tends to see the world. And if you know E. McGilchrist's works, he talks about in that way. It's kind of fuzzy, diffuse, vague kind of, field consciousness. That becomes concentrated, that becomes drawn in to our separate heads. And that's very much along the same lines that the Lurianic Kabbalah talks about the creation of the universe, where there's something they call the Zimzum, where God, in order to create the universe, has to contract. He has to sort of make an empty space to create the world. So again, it's just sort of a parallel. But yeah, so that happens, and at the very bottom of that V or that U is where we are now, where we feel completely separated from the world, where we don't feel the connection. We're lost in the cosmos. I guess even a generation or two earlier, they were more worried about it. Today, we just kind of, hey, that's how it is, man. The universe is meaningless, whatever, who cares, whatever, so, but, a couple generations ago, this kept people up at night, this kind of alienation and angst and all that kind of thing. But the upward movement is a kind of, not a return to the original participation, but, how should we say it? A kind of addition, a bringing back of the participation, maintaining the separate consciousness. So Steiner talks, it's kind of like you go back a step, you carry that over, and you have the new thing. And you could say in a way it's very Hegelian, because it's this kind of Aufhebung. You transcend one state, you keep what is good in it, and then you go into the next thing. So it's sort of like that. So what, again, where we are now, is it like all of us are suddenly going to wake up one morning and have this new participation? Well, I don't think so, but I think some people, different people out there, experience flashes of it or something along those lines. And gradually, Steiner would say this is something that would take all of humanity will experience it at some point down the line. So I don't know about that, but again, I can understand what he means, because it is something like that. When you do have those poetic moments, when you do those moments, you feel at one with nature. It is suddenly, my God, I didn't know this was so interesting. I felt like I was seeing the soul of the tree. Well, you are seeing the soul of the tree, but you're not losing your own ego consciousness to do that. You're not giving up your I consciousness, because this was essential. To develop the I was essential. Create a lot of problems, but that's the whole point. We grow by overcoming the difficulties of our advance.
Excellent.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, let us know. And so our next question is from Marcus, and Marcus is going to be on mic. So Marcus, you want to try to unmute yourself? If not, I can
hear me.
Yes, there you are. Perfect.
Okay, great. So my question kind of it takes off from that last slide. So it maybe leads into a little bit what you might talk about next week. But without getting to more like the practical aspects, I'm just kind of wondering on the philosophical level. Like I know in Dark Star, you talk about how right now with Keck and with the emergence of the alt-right, there's a sort of return to the imaginal and the symbolic space, and I'm guessing you would also concede that there's a return to some extent to figurative language. And so I'm just wondering, why do you think that's arriving ahead of the sort of Goethean synthesis? And is it inevitable that do you think that Goethean synthesis is kind of going to come eventually through the process of this more reactive symbolic movement, or is it going to be like an antagonism with it?
Well, no, it's an interesting question. I think in some ways you can see, what do you want to call this kind of, the sort of thing I talk about in Dark Star, the sort of use of the imagination in this kind of, I don't know, dubious, I don't know, what do you want to call it without getting too political about it? So, but, this kind of dark way. I think in many ways we can understand it as, Jung says the psyche creates a crisis that it needs in order to, somehow get over, the stalemate that it's in. It creates some kind of crises in order to break out of the stagnation it's in. So in some way, I think a lot of this questionable use of sort of imaginative, ideas are coming out because we haven't addressed them in an acceptable way. They've been sort of the return of the repressed. And in many, it's sort of what's needed. I mean, again, Jung talks about neuroses being positive things in the sense that even though they don't work, they're a sign that the psyche is trying to do something in order to make things better. So it's kind of like, yes, this imaginative, you're exactly right. This is what we're going to talk about in the next thing. Is it just any imagination that will work, or is there guidelines to the imagination? So this kind of, what do you want to say, questionable, dark kind of expression of it can suggest to me that, yeah, that's a sign that that's what's needed. But, if we're not able to address it in an acceptable way, make basically in a creative way that is going to come out in these other ways as well. And yeah, and it's reaching down to those visceral levels where it does operate on the magical level, because it isn't about reasoned argument. It's about images and symbols and slogans. And we can see the effect because it's having that polarizing effect. Now, again, that can be a good thing in the sense that that tension that's created by the polarization can fuel something that, produces something new. This is, I'm a great fan of what Jung calls the transcendent function. The opposition between the two things, creates the possibility for the new thing to happen. Whether it will or not, there's no guarantees. But I guess I'm hopeful about that. And again, I say it's up to us. No one else is going to do this. We're the only ones who are able to do it, and there's no one else out there. I don't mean we're the select crew. I just mean the sense that it's people who can do this. No one else can do this kind of thing. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking a good question.
Thanks.
Excellent. So our next question is from Francis. He's asking, are you suggesting that everything we experience is an artifact, a result of something that came before? If we want a different future, we must begin with where we are and create it responsibly?
God, I never say everything is everything. No, I don't know enough to say that. But I'm saying we're part of history. Is that, I'm trying to understand. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, and that's not your fault. That's most likely mine. But I mean, we're part of history. So yes, there's forces that have worked behind us in that way that have brought us up to this kind of place. But I also think that there's not only sort of forces working behind that are pushing us on. I wouldn't say forces, but there's the attraction of a goal. There's an attraction of something ahead. That would be the creative element of it. There's something ahead that we're trying to work towards. So again, I don't mean we're all in the same club and we're all doing the same thing, but I think in general in human consciousness, and I do think it is about this kind of bringing the two things together, the two sides together, because in the past when that has happened, it has been remarkable periods of either artistic development, even social development and things of that sort. And again, I'm optimistic in the sense that the more we understand more and more about these kinds of things, we can link things from our contemporary experience and contemporary research to ancient beliefs and ideas as well. And that suggests to me that we're all talking about the same kind of thing. So I do believe there is a kind of movement to, not unify completely in some final, wonderful harmony. But it certainly strikes me as the case that the kind of thing I'm trying to talk about in this book is something that needs to be brought in. And as Marcus just brought up, some aspects of it are already happening in the culture, but in a kind of dark way, put it that way. They're coming out, and the unconscious, whatever you want to call it, will come out, whether we do it or not. The idea is whether we can do it consciously, and work with it rather than just be subject to it. And I think that's the difference between having something that may be upsetting but is creative and having a catastrophe. So I don't know if that's addressed your question, but trying to put us in the context of history leading up to where we are now.
Excellent. So our next question, this one's from Chris as well, and he's just asking, does photosynthesis have anything to do with how Goethe saw light and color differently from Newton?
Not that I know of at the top of my head. I can't say I'm an expert on this. But the thing, I said that the difference is that Goethe was very much, again, this is the thing, you have to remember Goethe, this is what Faust is about. It's like, yes, we want to know things, but we also want to know things that are worth knowing. Knowledge that isn't going to basically help us in some way, he felt was, okay, fine, but it's actually something that in many ways will create more problems than good. And we are at the 200 years after his concerns. He was talking about his concerns, and we're surrounded by a world of this kind of technology and a variety of other things that many ways baffle people and everyone. And Goethe would certainly feel that the kind of constraints or limits that he wanted to put on the pursuit of knowledge just hadn't been, and we all know this. We all, it's, what has everyone been saying for the last whatever, how many 100 years? We're technologically advanced and morally we're still children at best. This is not news. This is how it is. Technology is easy. It's easy because it's this way of knowing. It's about pragmatic results. You can do that kind of thing. The other thing that Goethe is talking about, I'm talking about in a humble way. I'm only saying what all these other people have said already to keep it alive. It's much harder to do, but it's an interior sort of thing, and there aren't any kind of visible results. But it is about, do we need to know this? Not in the sense that let us be obscuritants, but let us recognize that, there are limits to what value we can get from this. So this is, and so it was different. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to keep the human at the center of his way of understanding the world. And so, as I said, the way he wanted to understand color was, how do we experience color? Not what is color made of? How do we experience it? That's the difference between a phenomenological kind of pursuit of understanding experience and a scientific reductive one who wants to break it down to smaller kinds of things. That's not what Goethe wants to do. That's okay, you can do that, but he's saying there's also this. He doesn't want to sort of, get rid of Newton completely and just put his own science in. No, he wants to add it to it. Don't forget this. This is what the whole movement from the rise of science has been saying. The whole occult counterculture, the romantics, the existentialists, everybody's been saying the same thing. Don't forget this stuff. This is the important stuff. It's the world of value, meaning, purpose, and all that kind of thing. And Goethe is someone who's showing how actually you can learn things about the world from that perspective, not only have high-minded, moral, platitudes about it, you can actually gain some actual knowledge. And he was right about the intermaxillary bone. He was right about Strasbourg Cathedral. He was right about some other things as well. So it's not like if you do this, you're going to get some knowledge that those guys can't get, but it's the same kind of knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge, and it's a different kind of knowing, but it's a kind of knowledge that's absolutely necessary.
Got it. Thanks.
Great.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And so here's, I think we got one or two more here. One's from Susan, and Susan's asking, what do people say was in the world before we were there? Was it a real substance or energetic interactions that gave the illusions of solidity? So I'm kind of
you can read them. It's Steiner has his own kind of view of things. As I said, he uses a rather uncomfortable language, I'd say, but he talks about old Saturn and old Sun and old Moon, and these are much less diffuse states of existence than our own. They're not solid like this, and actually, the initial sort of first state is a kind of heat or something like that. So it's, yeah, I mean, that's what he says. René Guénon says something different. Others say as well. Others don't say anything. They don't say, well, we don't know what it was like then, but we assume that it may very well have been something other than how we perceive it, because as I said, a lot of the creation myths are also about the creation of man. So the creation of the world and creation of humans. Okay, creation of the world and self-consciousness happen at the same time. So, but again, I think the general idea, if you take what Steiner and Barfield say, we can get some idea of what it was like from dream states, where, in a dream you can walk through a wall, right? You're not limited by time and space. We see images, pictures. It's not logical. It's not sequential. It's not linear. It's more right brain, to make a cliche out of it. So we can get some idea, and this is what Steiner says. Steiner says, if you want to get an idea of what he calls old moon consciousness, which was the stage of consciousness before our very clear, rational daylight kind of consciousness is. Look at your dreams, because it was like that. This is what he calls a kind of picture consciousness. And it's the same way if you pay attention to your dreams, and especially if you pay attention to what's known as the hypnagogic state as you're falling asleep and as you're waking up in the morning, you can very often get kind of images or sentences that seem absolutely weird and strange and make no sense. But if you actually pay attention to them, you see that they're actually a symbolic sort of statement about your state at the time. But it's communicated in symbols, not traditional symbols that you're going to go find in a book, but metaphoric, pictures will just like water under a bridge, something like that. And you'll see that. And there's some kind of intelligence in us, I don't know who it is, whatever, that's able to communicate something to us in this kind of way. So Steiner and Barfield saying that's kind of what it may have been, what it was like before our kind of very crystal clear, more or less kind of consciousness where things aren't diffuse and that kind of thing. But I guess Steiner would say, okay, the next step is to take that from the past, bring it up to now in the future, and combine the two. And in some ways, the hypnagogic state is some taste of that, because hypnagogic state, you're awake and you're dreaming at the same time, to put it simply. It's not lucid dreaming where you're dreaming and you're awake. You're awake and you're dreaming. So if you're lying in bed, falling asleep, or waking up in the morning, you can still sort of see kind of dream images, but also be aware of the outer world that you're in. Whereas lucid dreaming, you're in a dream and you realize you're dreaming. So your whole horizon is the dream. But hypnagogia, you see the outer world, but you also still see sort of dream images. And as I say, this is one of the things that this fellow Herbert Silberer, who was a follower of Freud and a colleague of Jung's, and who wrote about alchemy before Jung did. He did a lot of study in this, and he said it's self-symbolic. And that's the same thing that Steiner's sort of saying. He's sort of saying that, moon consciousness we saw in this kind of symbolic sort of way. So you kind of put it together and you think, well, okay, I don't know about Atlantis and Lemuria and old moon and old sun, but I know the way that he's describing what it's like is very much the way like he's describing what it's like. And I know when I have the flashes or the few moments of hypnagogia that I do experience, it is like that. So I put those things together, and that gives me an idea, what they're talking about, something that's real. They're talking about something that's there, that's an actual part of our experience.
All right, so let's see if we have any other closing questions here. Oh, this is a good one. And then we have one follow-up just for sort of what we'll be going over next time. But okay. Heather's asking, what kind of support have you had in creating or framing your own work?
Support. It's from you, listeners like you. No, I don't know what you mean by support. People buy my books. I've been lucky enough to have publishers that will pay me to write them. I mean, my God, I'm incredibly privileged to be able to do that. And nothing more. I like nothing more better than people getting in touch with me and saying, taking the ideas seriously and wanting to understand about that. This is remarkable for me that people are doing this. I think this is how it is. Little small groups of people want to talk about these things, and then you go off and spread the word, as it were. But I'm lucky enough to be able to devote my time to doing this, and that's as I said, it's people like you out there who are willing to devote time and energy to do this. Like, that's what better support could I ask for?
Okay, and we have one more question from. Oh, well, sort of a general one. Sergio's asking about Henry Corbin, if we're going to be going over Corbin.
The next one I'm going to try to put Corbin and Kathleen Raine kind of together with this idea of the responsibility of the imagination, which, as I've said, it's a phrase that Barfield talks about at the end of his book, Saving the Appearances. He wrote that book in the 50s. And I said, he came from a conservative background and all that, and he's religious and so on, but he was very concerned about sort of the trends in modern art at the time, and sort of the surrealists and stuff of that sort. And he was concerned that the way that they were seeing the world in this very weird, transgressive, shocking, at times, very disturbing kind of way, that because the imagination has a real power, he calls it figuration, because some part of our mind is out there actually. We're not creating the elementary particles, but we're putting them together, to make a nice picture of the world. The more our inner world was filled with these kind of images, the more the world will start to look like that. And I ask, well, it's 50 years since you wrote that. I mean, is the world a lot prettier now? I don't know. I leave it to you to understand. So that's the responsibility of the imagination. But Corbin says sort of the same thing. And he said there was a need for a kind of tradition that he said, it was rather like this whole kind of Neoplatonic idea we talked about, the Hermetic back up the planets, or the Gnostic, or the same thing with, Barfield and Steiner's V and U, this kind of levels of consciousness, levels of imagination, levels of reality. That unless we had something like that, then imagination just let loose by itself, he said, you know, would create more horrors, or more than likely create more horrors. So this is the question of whether, you know, is it just any imagination? You know, we've kept imagination down for such a long time, we should just let it go. And we know there's lots of movements, art movements have done that in different kinds of ways. Surrealism is probably, you know, the classic one. You know, they didn't even, they just basically let it go. You know, it's just material. But Dada and a variety of other kinds of ways in which we respond, well, react to the kind of constraints of rationality. But they're saying, well, no, that too is not right. Initially, it seems fantastic and liberating, but it runs out of steam after a while, and you need some kind of guidelines. And so the whole tradition of the imagination, which is what Kathleen Rain found in the English Romantic poets, going back to Neoplatonism, as Marcus pointed out in the first talk, and Corbin, who found a similar Neoplatonic tradition coming out of phenomenology. He started out as a phenomenologist. He was a student of Heidegger. He translated, he was the first translator of Heidegger into French, and people like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and people like that, you know, read his translations. But then he found this tradition in the, you know, Persian, 11th century Persian mystic Suhrawardi, who came out of a Neoplatonic Hermetic tradition, all that. So it's imagination, but it's a disciplined imagination. You know, again, and that's the difficult thing. How do you find out, you know, the true gauge of that? You know, we, in the real world, the outside world, we can see whether something is true or not in the sense of a fact. You know, but in the inner world, we don't have, we don't seem to have a similar kind of gauge. And I think that's what Kathleen Rain and Corbin were trying to provide. So we're going to talk about that.
Excellent. I think those are all the questions we have today. So I just want to thank you, Gary, for another excellent session. It's been wonderful.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure.
Thank you in the chat as well. And we're going to be meeting not next week, everybody, but the week after on December 8th. So we have a little bit of a extended.
Oh, okay.
It's like a.
Is that true?
Calendar.
All right.
I'll check the calendar right now as we're all here together. But I'm pretty sure we skip a beat here. Yeah. Yes. Because next Saturday is the 1st, and then the 8th is the one. So.
Okay. All right.
So okay. So we have a little bit more time.
All right. Well, see you then. All right. Thank you very much.
Take care.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good night, Gary. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.